Living in 21st century Britain, going to an Anglican church, you will often see religious imageries inside on a Sunday. Perhaps a small crucifix here or a huge one over the rood screen which separates the choir and the chancel from the nave and the congregation. Perhaps it's a more elaborate stained glass window where we see images of the crucifixion, the resurrection, the parables, or perhaps it's a little or not so little collection of statues of Mary and Joseph and baby Jesus and the shepherds and the angel and the magi which are brought out every Christmas for the seemingly mandatory crib service. This is just what church is like, right? And at home, perhaps you have pictures of Jesus, which probably look like Obi-Wan Kenobi from Star Wars with his white skin and blue eyes and blonde hair and fabulous beard. Or maybe you have an icon or a bookmark with Jesus knocking on a door while holding a lantern. But the existence and acceptability of such images is possibly the longest running and most costly disagreement between Orthodox creed-believing Christians throughout the past 2,000 years. The Church of England today is pretty much unrecognisable to 150 years ago, when putting a small cross behind your pulpit could literally cause violent riots in the street, and where all kinds of images, especially of Jesus, were seen as patently blasphemous and idolatrous. You see, like all the Reformed churches of the Reformation, the Anglican Church took a hard line and actively forbade and destroyed religious imagery in churches and encouraged their destruction in private homes, especially images of Jesus. The Anglican Church is what was called iconoclastic, that is, one who breaks clastic images. Icons, iconoclastic, those who break images. Indeed, believe it or not, to this very day, the Church of England's official teaching and doctrine is iconoclastic. As a minister, I had to vow to recognise and uphold the official doctrine of the Church of England as contained in the 39 Articles of Religion. And those 39 Articles of Religion tell us that in the Book of Homilies we find godly and wholesome doctrine. And the largest of those homilies, those sermons in that book, almost 15% of the entire thing, are the sermons against idolatry, in which religious imagery is banned in the Church of England. And this is not a new teaching. It has been a constant debate within the church, and the position against images is almost certainly the oldest and the original stance. So why is that? What changed? And how did all of this culminate in the so-called Seventh Ecumenical Council? Well, that is what we are hoping to learn together today. The second of the 10 Commandments reads, "Do not make an image for yourself, whether in the shape of anything in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or the waters under the earth. Do not bow in worship to them, and do not serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God." In the Bible, the word for image and the word for idol are the same word. There is no distinction between image and idol. And because of this, the Jews of the Old Covenant, outside of what God commanded within the temple, were very, very, very against images being used or being present in places of worship. To create an image or idol and worship it or reverence it is idolatry, a second commandment violation. Most importantly, there's the idea that above all else, the one thing you could never, ever, ever make an image of was God himself. Now, as the Jews went into exile and came back and then were dispersed again and again across the Roman Empire and into modern-day Syria and Iraq, this very hard position against images weakened somewhat. And things like flowers and vines were permitted as images in some synagogues as decoration. And in eastern Syria, we even have example of a synagogue with Bible story images, like the binding of Isaac and Moses being given the 10 Commandments, found on the walls of the Jura Europos synagogue. Though sadly it seems likely that the Islamic State destroyed that synagogue and indeed that whole archaeological dig whilst they were in charge. But in Judea, no such imagery or iconography is found in Jewish synagogues and buildings and meeting places. Now, being a branch off from Judaism, it's not surprising that early Christianity seems to have taken the same line as those from whom they came. Images and statues of humans, especially in places of worship, were idolatrous and second commandment violations. A whole raft of important church fathers wrote very strongly against images of Jesus or images in churches in general, including many who we've met before throughout the past 39 or so lectures. We have, for example, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Lactantius, Eusebius of Caesarea, Origen, Tertullian, Cyril of Alexandria, Epiphanius, Jerome, even St. Augustine. The 36th canon of the Synod of Elvira in Spain in 306 AD reads as follows: "It has been decreed that no pictures shall be had in the churches, and that which is worshipped or adored be not painted on the walls." Various other church figures and even Eastern Roman emperors argued and decreed against images in places of worship. But even in these first 500 years or so, things were not clear-cut, just as they weren't in Judaism. In many places, Christians do not seem to have had images, though there is one key thing they often didn't have. There were generally no images of Jesus. So even if they had something, images of Jesus were incredibly rare. Instead of Jesus, early Christians tended to use pictograms or symbols like the cross, a fish, peacock, anchor, Cairo. These were used, or there were generic images such as a generic shepherd, or even the image of Jonah inside the great fish for 3 days as someone who typifies Christ who was in the tomb for 3 days. But actual images of Jesus were very rare. One place where they have been found is that same place in Syria, Jura Europos, where there was a synagogue that had images of people. There's also some been found in the catacombs in Rome, particularly those dating to later dates. But that so few images exist in these first few centuries and that other pictograms were used instead should not be surprising. Jesus is God. And the number 2 commandment of the whole Bible is don't make images to represent God. Another perhaps unsurprising thing is that of all the images of the first 4 centuries or so, which do depict Jesus, none of them seem to actually agree on what he looked like. They all imagined him within their own context. For example, one image in Syria depicts him as a noble-born Greek philosopher. In the catacombs of Rome, he's seated in majesty with a beard upon the throne of an imperial king. In some images, he does miracles with a magic wand in his hand, as miracle workers of that time were expected to do. And he was often depicted as a beardless young man. And then, slowly, increasingly, as more and more pagans converted to Christianity following the victories of Constantine the Great, Jesus is increasingly portrayed as a bearded lord, like Zeus or Jupiter, the great kings of the pantheons of the Greeks and Romans, seated on a heavenly throne looking down upon the earth. In the East, the making of statues remained strictly taboo, but in the West, over the years, where the barbarian hordes overran, the creation of even religious statues would begin to bloom. Increasingly, in the West, following those barbarian invasions, images were used and allowed in churches to educate people. The barbarians didn't speak Latin, they didn't know the Bible stories, they had no access to the Bible in their own languages. And so popes such as Gregory the Great thus allowed images in churches for educational purposes. But even as he did so, other bishops, such as Cyrenus of Marseille, were tearing down images they found in churches within their areas. Now, over time, relics of saints, items they had, parts of their bodies, and relics claiming to be from Jesus himself, became associated as being locuses of divine power, items which connected people to the divine and brought fortune and power and good luck. And so they were carried as standards during battles and brought out during natural disasters such as droughts and earthquakes. And over time, especially approaching the 600s AD, images too began to be seen as locuses through which the divine and the human met and interacted. Suddenly we had appearing allegedly miraculous images of Jesus, never before seen to this point, mind you, but which were said to have been not made by human hands. Things like a cloth on which Jesus had his face and then the image remained on it for all time. Like all of these relics though, these are probably not actually the case. But as these images too began to be used as these locuses of power and divine favour and were worshipped and revered and bowed down to, the church had to avoid accusations of idolatry. And so distinctions were made between worship or latreia, due to God alone, latreia, worship to God alone, and veneration or dulia, which was due to saints and relics and images. Worship and veneration were suddenly seen as two distinct things, even though that isn't a biblical distinction, and remained contested by many others in the church. What started off as a clear commandment against creating, worshipping and bowing down to images had moved to allowing their creation for the purposes of education and aesthetic design, to even bowing down before them and reverencing them, but claiming a distinction between that and real worship due only to God. And behind all of that raged a theological question. Jesus is God, and thus it is forbidden to depict him, for images of God are certainly violations of the second commandment. But Jesus is also human. He took on flesh, and so images of him could technically be made in a way they never could be of God before, like if you were able to take a photo of Jesus. But would that image actually capture the fact that he is also fully God and fully human? Does it capture his human and divine nature at once? Or does it separate them, allowing you only to portray the human side and thus sliding into the heresy of Nestorianism? As all of this rumbled on, the pagan Roman Empire becoming Christian, the throwing of endless reserves of money at the church now filled with people used to worshipping images of gods, the West being overrun by the barbarian tribes, all of this led to those in favour of images, iconophiles, lovers of images, iconophiles, gaining a clear ascendancy over the iconoclasts, those against images. Sure, some people seemingly continued to protest, but it was clear who had the upper hand. That changed, though, when the real upper hand went to Islam, and over the course of 100 years they humiliated the Byzantine Empire with defeat after defeat after defeat. No amount of carrying relics and images seemed to achieve victory. The Muslims themselves were staunch iconoclasts, strictly forbidding all imagery and using geometric designs only in their mosques, and indeed among the stricter areas forbidding all imagery of anything in creation, even in secular contexts. Maybe they were right. The increasing in-your-face use of images in churches led to the iconoclasts, those against images, being more vocal. That, combined with the rise of Islam, would lead to what is known as the Byzantine Iconoclastic Controversy. The iconoclasts would ultimately lose this battle, and their condemnation at the so-called Seventh Ecumenical Council, and later the triumph of orthodoxy, where iconoclasm in the East was finally ended at the death of the last iconoclastic emperor, Theophilos. It's a difficult name, Theophilos, in 842, and a synod the following year supporting the lovers of images. But before then, there would be 100 years of controversy and dispute. The sources of this period are almost always written by the victors, and so their representation of the iconoclasts must be taken with a pinch of salt, and ultimately we may never know the full motivations and theology of those who were against images. So, in about 730 AD, Byzantine Emperor Leo III, following major natural disasters and defeats at the hands of Muslims, forbade the use of images in churches except for plain crosses. At least that's how the traditional telling of the story goes. But this didn't come from nowhere. Many people in the empire were suspicious and against the increasing use of images in some churches. And some churches had already begun to be removing images before getting imperial empire-wide backing. Pope Gregory the Great rebuked the Byzantine emperor and affirmed that images were good, at least for educating the masses. Itself something controversial in the West. And this led to Emperor Leo confiscating papal estates in Italy, Sicily, and the Balkans. Perhaps coincidentally, the removal of images by Leo had a number of very successful battles causing against the invading Muslims. In the latter years of his reign, he essentially ended a long string of Muslim invasions of his lands, turning the tide of what had been 100 years of humiliation and defeat. Leo's son Constantine V, reigning from 741 to 775, was likewise against images. He too was very successful militarily against the Muslims and other invaders from the north. Constantine held a church council in 754 in Hieria, which was attended by 340 bishops from across his lands, but none from the Pope or the other Eastern patriarchs who were still under the control of Islam, meaning it could not be considered an ecumenical council, even though it claimed to be based on how many bishops were there. This council roundly condemned images in churches as something introduced to the church by the devil. Now, during this time, a Syrian monk living under Muslim rule named John of Damascus would hero the iconophile, the image-loving cause, and promote the use of images, saying they affirmed the power of the incarnation and God becoming man. His book, a number of arguments about why images were good and iconoclasm was bad would be the foundation for the pro-image arguments of that time and decades to come. He would be the last Eastern theologian to have any real impact on Western Christianity. John of Damascus, champion of icons. Now, Constantine V would be succeeded by Leo IV, who was married to Irene, who we met last time when discussing Charlemagne. When Leo IV died, his son was too young to rule, and so Irene took power as regent. Irene would call an ecumenical council, partly, we think, in hopes of restoring good relations with the West and the Pope, who was none too happy with the previous decade of iconoclasm, nor the idea of a woman as regent on the Roman throne. This council, the Second Council of Nicaea, the Seventh Ecumenical Council, was held in 787 in the city of Nicaea, and despite disruption by anti-image military units, the 308 bishops and their representatives, 40 or so fewer than the previous council in Hierea, which condemned images, but including some from the Pope, condemned that previous council as a robber council and strongly affirmed images. In fact, it not only strongly affirmed images, it basically mandated them as necessary to true Christianity. This is a section of what was decreed at that council. As the sacred and life-giving cross is everywhere set up as a symbol, so also should images of Jesus Christ, the Virgin Mary, the holy angels, as well as those of the saints and other pious and holy men, be embodied in the manufacture of sacred vessels, tapestries, vestments, etc., and exhibited on the walls of churches, in the homes, and in all conspicuous places, by the roadside, and everywhere, to be revered by all who might see them. For the more they are contemplated, the more they move to fervent memory of their prototypes. Therefore it is proper to accord to them a fervent and reverent veneration, not, however, the veritable adoration, which according to our faith belongs to the divine being alone. For the honour accorded to the image passes over to its prototype, and whoever venerate the image, venerate in it the reality of what is there represented. Ironically, despite the hopes of Irene to use this to bolster union with the West, and although the Pope supported the council, the Frankish kingdom of Charlemagne rejected the council at a synod in 794 and created a book refuting the arguments of the council and those who were against images. And this book was called the Libri Carolini, and the full version, which also refuted the arguments of the Pope, was never actually sent to the Pope by Charlemagne, who decided against antagonizing him. And it was not actually published until 1547, when iconoclasm once again rose up during the Protestant Reformation. With no support for the council from Charlemagne, Irene also ruined her good graces with the Pope, when in 797 her son came of age to take his rightful place upon the throne she had been keeping warm for him, and therefore she had his eyes ripped out and him thrown into a dungeon to starve to death so she could remain and rule as empress. With a woman on the throne, the Pope crowned Charlemagne, despite his resistance to images, the new Roman emperor. Iconoclasm was not finished in the East, though, and despite that ecumenical council, when Leo V took the throne in 813 and argued that every emperor who had supported images had met their death either in war or in revolt, and only the emperors who were against images had actually died of natural causes in their own age for centuries, well, he decided to be against images. The Byzantine Empire would once again become iconoclastic till the death of Emperor Theophilus in 842, who died, not in war or revolt, it might be added, and upon dying had a son who was too young to reign, and so his wife Theodora became regent. She, like Irene 50 years before, restored images at a synod in 843, which finally ended the controversies and is still celebrated as an annual church feast by the Eastern Orthodox Church, known today as the Triumph of Orthodoxy. Various Christian and heretical groups across Europe and the East would continue to oppose images in churches, and especially images of Christ. And to this day, the Eastern Orthodox churches are against images of the Father for the following 700 years, till the Protestant Reformation brought iconoclasm back onto the scene, where it remains to this day among the Reformed churches.